Everybody, lovely to see so many of you here, and welcome also to all the people who are joining us online from all over the world. This event is hosted by the Friends of Julian of Norwich, which is a charity that's set up to support and encourage knowledge and understanding of Julian and her writing. We're a membership organisation, and we're very proud to say that we have members in every continent of the world. A modest subscription gets you a newsletter, first access and discounts to all our events. So if any of you feel like joining, you can find out how to do that on julianofnorwich.org. We're also looking for volunteers to help us put on these events. And given that we're now screening most of our events online, worldwide, we're particularly looking for volunteers who either have technical skills or are prepared to learn technical skills to help us with this work. It wouldn't be arduous because we only do a few events each year, but if anybody's interested, could they please let themselves be known to Howard, who is our secretary? Can you wave, Howard? Thank you. Or Shirley, who is our chairman at the back. So we'd be very grateful if there was anybody who's prepared to put a few hours in to help us provide more events like this. Just a bit of housekeeping now. So in the event of a fire, highly unlikely, but please, no hiding in Julian's cell, everybody out of the main door, please. This morning's lecture will last about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions. And then there's light refreshments available at the Julian Centre, which is just up the road on the corner there, and everybody is welcome to come for a cup of tea and a bit of cake. Right, so it's now my very great pleasure to introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Sarah Salih, reader in English literature at King's College London. She's an expert in late medieval English writing and culture, with particular interests in the intersections of medieval literature, history, art and religion, questions of gender and sexuality. Sarah's got local connections, as she did her PhD here at UEA and began her teaching career there, starting as a mere graduate teaching assistant and rising to senior lecturer in medieval literature before moving on to King's College. In addition to her teaching, she has an impressive list of publications, 2 books, Versions of Virginity in Late Medieval England and Imagining the Pagan in Late Medieval England, as well as editing and contributing to a great many collections of essays on medieval literature. I first met Sarah when I was working as a producer-director for the Norwich-based production company Tin Can Island, and we had persuaded the BBC to commission a documentary about Julian of Norwich and a transmission of her manuscript. The commissioning editor at the BBC told us that she wanted us to go hard on the feminist angle. And our researcher, the historian Margit Toffler, said, oh, well, if they want a feminist angle, we'd better talk to Dr. Sarah Salih, which we did. And of course, we filmed with her. Of the many fascinating things that Sarah told us about Julian, had to say about Julian, the one that stayed with me was her saying that every time she read Revelations of Divine Love, she found something new in it. And that resonated with my own experience. But I've had a sneak preview of today's lecture, and I think we will all be going away with some new ideas about Julian today. So please join your hands and join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah.
Well, thank you so much, Sally Ann, for that extremely kind introduction. Thank you, Sally Ann and the Friends of Julian for inviting me to be here. Thank you so much to St Julian's and all at St Julian's for hosting it. And thanks to everyone who's shown up as well. It is great to see you. And yes, as you said, Julian's Revelations is something that one keeps coming back to over a lifetime, I think. It's not the text that I've published most on by any means, but I know nothing like it for feeling like you are in contact with somebody's mind. And yes, it shows you different facets on each reading. It shifts as Julian writes at the end of the long text, it is not yet performed. It is made anew at every reading. And certainly I would not claim to understand it, and I don't expect that I ever will. So I work on, as Salih said, Middle English writing, late medieval culture more generally, and within that, one of my main topics is gender and sexuality. Which is by no means only about women's writing, it's also about men's writing. But women's writing is certainly one aspect of it. So I come at Julian primarily from a literary historicist standpoint, interested where she fits into Middle English literature and late medieval culture. But reading Julian is also what alerted me to realise that historicism is not enough, because to realise that she also has a constituency who read her in the present, who understand her to address the present as a woman of our day, and that thus she is a contemporary writer as well as a medieval one. Now, I first read Julian, I believe, when I was an MA student, which means that I read her because she was a woman, because my MA was on women in the late medieval world. And Julian has always been known as a woman writer, that the early modern exiled English nuns, to whom we owe our copies of the long text, knew her as Julian, the Holy Virgin, Julian the Anchoress of Norwich. And the Catholic priest, Serenus Cressy, in the first printed edition of that long text, named its author as Mother Juliana, an Anchoret of Norwich, and included in his dedication to his patron, Lady Mary Blount, a sketch of feminine intimacy through the centuries. And the text on the slide, please. Yeah, okay, so this is Father Cressy to Lady Mary. The author of it is a person of your own sex who lived about 300 years since, intended it for you and for such readers as yourself. Your ladyship will, I assure myself, afford her, Julian, a place in your closet where at your devout retirements you will enjoy her saint-like conversation, attending to her, whilst with humility and joy she recounts to you the wonders of our Lord's love to her and of his grace in her. So, you know, a very gendered positioning of Julian in the closet of a lady, and a very intimate picture of the readership of reading Julian as being a contact, almost a physical contact across the centuries. And then the next year, the Anglican bishop, Edward Stillingfleet, responded to this publication with a misogynist and sectarian polemic in which the fact that Julian was a woman, again, was central to the discourse, this time in order to discredit her and her readers. And the slide.
Going the other way.
Yeah, we're back.
I don't know.
I mean, I have the text here, but it's just helpful if
Yes.
you can see it as well.
I think if you carry on without.
Okay, I'll carry on. Anyway, so this is Bishop Stillingfleet complaining about Julian, of the fanaticism of the Roman Church, the great number of female revelations approved in the Roman Church, which is how you know it's fanatical, because they listen to women. We may justly admire what esteem Mr. Cressy had of that lady to whose devout retirements he so gravely commends the blasphemous and senseless tittle-tattle of this hysterical gossip. Yes, I know. It's dreadful stuff, isn't it? It's dreadful. So readers have always known Julian as a woman, have always read her as a woman. Yet, you know, she is, you know, there are ways in which she's a slightly awkward fit for the category, and in which she's an opportunity to unpick a little what we mean by women's writing. So certainly, you know, she was a woman. She says so herself in the short text. And the head note confirms that she was now, you know, a historical person, a devout woman that is recluse at Norwich and is yet on life, is still alive. And we have the encounter, the evidence as well of the bequests and the encounter described in the book of Marjorie Kemp. And certainly she wrote, though the head note to the short text, which is the only version we know to have circulated in her lifetime, emphasised her as the visionary rather than the writer. And so what difficulty? I mean, I'm prompted here by having a slightly difficult time of it teaching Julian when I worked here at UEA in Norwich as part of a module on medieval women writers. And because it seems such a good and obvious fit, right? You know, here we are in Norwich. Julian was a woman who was a writer. But you know, it was hard. It was hard to make that approach work. You know, largely because the text on the face of it is not centrally about being a woman. So you know, trying to read it through that lens means that you get quite a partial view of the text. And here, you know, Julian's contemporary and acquaintance, Marjorie Kemp, is an instructive contrast. The book of Marjorie Kemp is emphatically a gendered text. That its proem, it could be a parable about the obstacles in the way of women's access to literate culture, showing the unlettered author protagonist, Marjorie Kemp, dependent on the not entirely satisfactory or indeed willing services of 3 different men to get the book written at all. And it goes on to place the genesis of Marjorie's visionary life in her marriage bed, in the crisis when she was unable to confess after the birth of her first child. And thereafter, Marjorie's often a difficult marriage, her sexual desires and revulsions, and her strongly effective relationship with Jesus are the central themes thereafter. Now, that's women's writing. That is a woman writing about her life experience and how her life is saturated by gendered expectations, her own and other people's, about how a woman should or should not be. And the fact that it is also men's writing, that it has been at the minimum filtered through and possibly more substantially edited by her scribes, just shows how inescapable those assumptions were. But as you know, Julian's book isn't like that. Now, she is, as she in many ways, as she ought to be, a centrepiece of feminist medievalism. The first woman we know to have written a book in English. And what a book! You know, this subtle and poetic and sophisticated and profound book. Not just a historical curiosity for medievalists, something that normal people read too. A book that still lives as a meditation and a theology. And this woman wrote, of course, in this deservedly famous sequence of her long text of the motherhood of Jesus. So in this lovely passage here, and thus is Jesus, our very mother, in kind of our first making. And he is our very mother in grace by taking of our kind maid. All the fair working and all the sweet, kindly offices of dear worthy motherhood is impropered to the second person. For in him we have this godly will, whole and safe without end, both in kind and in grace of his own proper goodness. And Julian, of course, did not invent the concept of the motherhood of God. It's a minority tradition, certainly not a particularly common figure, but one that had been explored and developed by contemplative monks of the 12th century, as Caroline Walker Bynum shows. And so the next one. Yeah, okay, so here's Bynum. So this new enthusiasm for the mother Jesus of medieval religious writers is usually concentrated on 13th and 14th century uses of the image, especially on the sophisticated theology developed around it by the anchoress Julian of Norwich, and has often implied that such a devotional tradition is particularly congenial to women and therefore must have been developed by or for or about them. But the first flowering of the image after the patristic period, however, appears to have come in the 12th century in the works of men. So in the works, that is, Bynum goes on to detail of monks such as Bernard of Clairvaux, Aelred of Rievaulx, men who used feminine imagery to celebrate God as being sacrificial, loving, generative, nurturing, whilst they themselves also, did their best to avoid any personal interactions with women whatsoever. So God's motherhood is not inherently, as Bynum is pointing out here, a woman's figure, let alone a feminist one. And Julian indeed may have found a hint of it in the male-authored Unclean Awissa, which likens God to a mother playing hide and seek with a toddler. Yet most writers on Julian do feel that it matters that she, a woman, chose to adopt and develop this theme. Liz McAvoy, for example, putting this development of Jesus' motherhood at the centre of a subtle elucidation of the maternal hermeneutic in Julian's text. And I'll quote for that in a minute. And also in the short text, Julian called attention to her being a woman writer and the difficulty of that position. And slide, please. Here we are. So this is again famous passage, but God forbid that you should say or take it so that I am a teacher. For I mean not so, no, I meant never so. For I am a woman, lewd, feeble, and frail. But for I am a woman, should I therefore believe that I should not tell you of the goodness of God, since I saw in that same time that it is his will that it be known. So it's a delicately balanced statement, that there's an urgent retreat from authority that nevertheless ends up with Julian standing her ground, that she is a woman and she will tell what she saw. And it makes a demand that is not negligible, that a woman may speak of the things of God. But you can understand why she faltered, why she felt the need to be a little defensive at this point. The idea that women's visionary knowledge might be recorded in textual form was not unknown in her world. Marjorie Kemp knew of a book that she understood to be the Treatise of St. Elizabeth of Hungary. But it certainly wasn't common. And as far as we can tell, I think Julian's identifiable sources, such as they are all men, male writers. And we might compare Christine de Pisan. Okay, another slide. So Christine is writing in France a little later, still in Julian's lifetime, and she also is, facing, starting her text with the cringe, writing herself out of the cringe of a woman operating under patriarchy. And Christine says how she too flinched before the powerful cultural forces that insisted on women's inferiority, but then kind of worked herself out of that and into a more confident position where she could proclaim, as we see here, that there is no doubt that nature provided women with the qualities of body and mind found in the most learned men. Let me tell you about women who have possessed great learning and profound understanding. And this is an image from the manuscript of Christine in her study, coming to this realization. And Christine then wrote a whole book about great women of history and legend, defending women's capacity throughout, whilst Julian seemingly dropped the subject as soon as she had established that she had in fact resolved to tell what she had seen, what she understood God meant her to tell. And in the long text of when Julian came to rewrite that passage, but for I am a woman, she repeated, as she'd already written in the short text, for I look singularly to myself, I am right naught. So sinking her own individuality into a communal identity with her even Christian, her fellow Christians. But in the long text, she also cut that passage I just quoted, that defends her right to speak even as a woman. And indeed, nothing in the long text identifies her as a woman. She calls herself by the ungendered term creature. And I think I go along with most readers to understand this shift as most likely indicating an increase in confidence. By the time that she came to write the long text, Julian no longer needed to defend her right as a woman to write. She had already, as a woman, written the short text, and clearly the sky had not fallen in. And I wonder too, and again, I'm not alone in this, whether the ageing and reclusion made the question of her gendered being feel less urgent. Julian, living as a recluse, was still a woman, but she was removed from the sexual economy and from women's usual duties. In her enclosed life, she was no longer subject to the curse of Eve. Slide, please. Oh, sorry, that's rectitude. Yeah, we should have had that one before. Let's have the next slide. And next one. Sorry, there we are. So the curse of Eve, as illustrated from Norwich Cathedral. So Julian having no husband to be subject to, though she would of course have had to reckon with masculine ecclesiastical authority. So she was still a woman, yes, but a very particular kind of woman, a career virgin once she had entered enclosure. Whatever her own previous history had been, and which of course we don't know, and there are different opinions about. But not that she dwells on that identity either. Although, most of us who work on Julian assume that she had access to perhaps the Ancrina Wissa or some other anchoritic guidebook, she is not, as it is, preoccupied with the curation of virginity. Now, Ancrina Wissa, slide please, this is a book about how to be a virgin. And so is the frail vessel that is women's flesh. Although the balm, the balsam contained in it is virginity, or after the loss of virginity, chaste cleanness, this frail vessel is as fragile as any glass, For once it is broken, it may never be mended to its former wholeness any more than glass can. So because of the fragility of virginity, it needs to be carefully tended every day with prayer and asceticism and humility. Now, Julian probably did live a life much like that outlined in the Uncra Nawissa, with its regular cycle of prayers. But its concepts of virginity don't really make it into her text, or maybe only encoded in imagery. So Julian, who never called herself a writer, refused to call herself a teacher, also seems to have stopped calling herself a woman. That she's consistent in her self-effacement and withdrawal from the text, although paradoxically it is such a distinct and individual voice. And the position of the book in the curriculum, meanwhile, has been travelling in the opposite direction from Julian's shift in self-representation from a frail woman to the more neutral creature. So if you read Julian in an academic context in the university curriculum, maybe 30 years ago, you would have been more likely to encounter her in a course called something like Middle English Mystics. But she's now more likely to turn up under the heading of perhaps early women writers. And a slide, please. Okay, so this is showing us, this is the slide of the most readily available paperback translations over the last few decades. And so this is showing you the shift. So the first one here, so that's the version that I first read Julian in. And the image there includes, of course, it includes a woman visionary, but the emphasis of the image is on the vision, not the visionary, which indeed is what how Julian herself frames what's important about the book. But these later two, whilst not, without at all claiming that these are pictures of Julian, these cue us to think about a woman, to think about an alert and observant woman, or a withdrawn and contemplative one. And so when you open one of these books, you're reading something that is already framed as a gendered text. Yet, how far is it? Next slide, please. Diane Watt writes, there is an influential strand of scholarship that argues that Julian of Norwich should not be located within a specifically feminine and mystical tradition. According to this viewpoint, despite her identification with the Virgin Mary in both versions of the work, and her extended discussion in A Revelation of Love of Christ as Mother, Julian's theology and writing transcends her sex. And in a way, all I'm saying is that I lean a bit more towards this line of thinking than Diane Watt herself does. But I nevertheless would like to claim that, querying the femininity of Julian's texts and having some doubt about it is also a feminist position. Now, I would not say exactly that Julian transcends gender, although Julian herself might have been more receptive to that formulation. Because, being born and raised a gendered being in a gendering society is not something to be easily transcended. But committing to religious life can be gender disruptive. A society in which a not negligible number of people were vowed to perpetual chastity had a gender system that was a bit fuzzier than a simple binary, and maybe some of that disruption feeds its way into the text. So while Julian certainly was a woman writer, but it might also be worth considering that sometimes she may be a non-binary writer or a gender fluid writer. Because committed virginity is sometimes understood to resist sexualizing and gendering effect of the fall, to be an, of course, inadequate imitation of unfallen humanity. And such virginity, St. Augustine wrote, is perpetual incorruption in the corruptible flesh. And Julian's understanding of the uncorrupted godly will in each flawed human strikes me as being at least aesthetically an echo of that Augustinian position on virginity. But if so, she universalized it. She made it not just about people like her, she made it about all believing Christians. Now, Diane Watt goes on to argue for looking for the specifically feminine characteristics of Julian's writing, and plenty of other Julianists would agree. Next slide, please. So Liz McAvoy here. So she makes a lovely, lovely subtle reading of the imagery, and she's finding here this the maternal hermeneutic of the mutual enclosure of Jesus and Julian. So here, the hazelnut of Julian's text takes up this theme of reproductive potential, which the theme of womb-like enclosure has already established in the text. and in particular reiterates the powerful powerless paradox, which we saw Julian draw upon in the context of the Virgin. Not only is it a little thing which can lie in the palm of the hand, but enclosed within it is all that is made. And when examined in association with Julian's other use of gynocentric imagery, the hazelnut encompasses perfectly all the patterns which we have seen emerge so far. Like the womb, like Mary, like all women generally, this little thing is small and intact, and yet it is capable of housing within its walls future promise and growth. It will bring forth a new tree infinitely larger than itself and infinitely more powerful. And I think it's just a beautiful, beautiful reading of Julian. It's very, very perceptive, very perceptive, very poetic in itself, and very persuasive. I am not in any way arguing with this. I think it's right. But I also think, there's space to consider readings that don't necessarily foreground the feminine gendering. To return to my attempt to teach Julian as a medieval woman writer, one difficulty I had was in selecting textual excerpts that I wanted, of course, but for I am a woman from the short text to talk about women in relation to literary and religious authority. And of course, I also wanted the motherhood of Jesus chapters from the long text. And I don't at all think there's anything wrong with mixing up bits from the two texts, but I did feel troubled that they seemed to be kind of pulling in different directions. That maybe the aspiration to universalism that allowed Julian to understand Jesus to be a mother who nevertheless goes by masculine pronouns, was also the same aspiration that drew her to be less overt about her own gendered identity. And both of these are, I think, correctives to the assumptions of normative masculinity, that God and those who write about him should be coded masculine. But correcting that in the one instance demanded highlighting gender in the exploration of God's motherhood and obscuring it in the other, as Julian decided that everyone can write about God, and she just took gender out of the picture. And her revision of the fall in the Lord and servant vision is arguably part of the same ungendering process. And it's an extraordinary vision, obviously, many striking features, but many of which I'm really not qualified to understand. But one is that Julian doesn't include Eve in her account of the fall. She doesn't, as many Middle English treatments did, read the fall as the institution of women's subordination. And the slide, please. Okay, so this is from Caro Salter. So this is a book which Julian potentially might have known. And so we've got a sequence here showing the fall and the institution here of gendered division of labour, with the giving of Adam the spade and Eve the distaff. And it looks here like somebody has scratched Eve's face, so as if somebody was angry with her. So there's this pent up, potentially misogynistic resentment against Eve. But Julian took the opportunity of writing about the fall to insist on the fundamental unity of humanity. In the sight of God, all man is one man, she wrote, and one man is all man. And man here being a truly generic term, as it can be in Middle English, meaning humans without distinction of gender. So there is no Eve, there is just the servant who is Adam, and therefore Eve too, for all men are one, and who is also the Son, who is also the second person. So, I think the people who write about the feminine implications of Julian's enclosure imagery are right. But while individuals do not simply become ungendered souls in contemplation, the contemplative zone, sometimes gender goes to play, goes to be differently, goes to detach itself from its worldly partners. The soul is ungendered, except when it's feminine, as in anima, a Latin feminine noun, or when it's masculine, as in the Middle English poem, As I Lay on a Winter's Night. In contemplation, a man may cast himself as the bride, as does Bernard of Clairvaux, or may compose impassioned addresses to Jesus to be spoken in a woman's voice, as does the author of The Wooing of Our Lord. And a slide, please. Okay, so here we've got the Mount Grace monks reading Marjorie Kemp, and I think they're leaving annotations showing that they're reading her in a kind of participatory way. They're reading the good bits to each other. They're kind of dramatising the life of Marjorie Kemp as they go along, so they adopt a voice. And so this is just one of these annotations in which they kind of enthusiastically speak back to her. Yes, Jesus is your love. when she describes the motif on her engraved ring. And another slide. And here, in contemplation, the bride here may wield the spear. She's kind of stabbing across the division of the manuscript there, as she does here in the Rothschild's Canticles. And Jesus is both gender fluid and gender excessive. The glorious masculine saviour, the lover knight of the Oncrena Wissa, and the patient suffering feminized life giver that we meet in Julian. The contemplative world is full of inversions. Girls will be boys and boys will be girls. We might hypothesize. Just suppose Julian's text had become dissociated from Julian's name, as Marguerite Perret's Mirror of Simple Souls did. Perret's work circulated as an anonymous mystical treatise, while Perret's authorship was forgotten. The Sloane manuscript omits details of Julian's name and location and profession. So if that had been our only surviving witness, would we have guessed this to be a woman's text? I mean, certainly the discussion of divine motherhood would be something that we would want to look at when thinking about gender in late medieval devotional culture, but it would not necessarily lead straight to the conclusion that it was written by a woman. If this were an anonymous text, we might see more of the readings that focus on the ways in which that sequence is not a straightforward transference of human motherhood to the divine, but it's also a making strange of it, structured as a set of contrasts. So, for example, while a human mother feeds their children with milk, Jesus feeds with himself, for example. It's a quite odd and estranging treatment of motherhood in many ways. And final point, I think, here now. It's another extraordinary fact that the second book we know to have been written by a woman in English, the Book of Margery Kempe, was written by a woman who actually knew the writer of the first one. And so it's very, very tempting to hypothesize a causal relationship between these two points of fact. So creative retellings of the meeting of Margery and Julian sometimes imagine that Julian's example gave Margery the impetus and the courage to write her own book. A slide, please. So this is from a recent novel, and here Julian hands Margery her manuscript for safekeeping, which prompts Margery to think, when I look at Dame Julian's papers, I wonder what it is to write. What does it mean to record one's passing thoughts, rendering them in ink so that they can whisper themselves into another's mind? Last week, Jesus spoke to me in my mind again and said I should write my own book, for by my writing down my own visions, many a man would turn to him and be saved. And of course, it's immensely tempting to think that in that meeting of Julian and Margery, we have the start of an English woman's literary tradition. But Margery's book is the only witness, and it doesn't quite say so. It's not clear whether Margery, in fact, knew that Julian had written. She consults Julian as an expert in the discernment of spirits. And the slide, please. The Mount Grace monks who owned Margery's manuscript do seem to have heard of Julian, because when Margery mentions her, they highlight it. They write Dame, Brother Bedink writes Dame Julian in the margin. So access to some version of her book seems to be the most likely vector of their knowledge. But the proem of the book, recounting Margery's various consultations with spiritual authorities, seems to make a distinction. And the next slide, please. That all those to whom she revealed her secrets, said she, Margery, was much obliged to love our Lord for the grace that he revealed to her. And they counselled her to follow her inclinations and promptings, and trustingly believed that they were from the Holy Ghost and from no evil spirit. Now, certainly Julian is included in that group of all of those, because Julian, that's what Margery records Julian as advising her, and that Julian was particularly emphatic that Margery should trust in the Holy Spirit. Margery then goes on, some of these worthy and honourable clerics accepted on peril of their souls, and as they would answer to God, that this creature was inspired with the Holy Ghost, and begged that she should have them write and make a book of her feelings and her revelations. Some offered to write down her feelings with their own hands. So Julian is certainly included in the first sentence, but Probably not in the subsection, the sum of those, because these people who, in having endorsed Marjorie's visions, go on to encourage her to make them into a book, as of course she did. Because those people who suggest making a book, who are themselves willing to offer to help with it, are clerics, clerickies in Marjorie's Middle English, that is, almost certainly men. And there's no hint in Marjorie's report of Julian's advice to her that she made any such suggestion. So, you know, much as one would like to think that the second known woman to write a book in English was consciously following the example of the first known woman to write a book in English, we don't quite have the confirmation that Marjorie's book was the imitation that would confirm that we could place Julian's as the origin, the point of origin of a literary genealogy. And her book is, of course, quite different. Although Marjorie also could have called hers something like A Revelation of God's Love, and the reported conversation with Julian does a good job of showing what the two women had in common. Their decisions about what kind of material should be included to demonstrate the workings of God's mythology are really very different. So Julian was a woman writer. We have good reasons to call her that and to celebrate her as such. But, you know, I doubt it's a category she would have identified herself with. And I think there is a case to be made that one of the very many things going on in this book is a kind of utopian aspiration to undoing the work of gender.
Was wonderful. Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm sure we all really enjoyed that. Are there any questions before? We're now going to open for questions and answers. It was a very provocative talk, so I'm sure there must be some questions that people would like to ask Sarah. Margit at the back there.
Thank you, Sarah. Really enjoyed that. And I'm sorry you were right. The screen and it's not really but I'm wondering what you make of what we know of circulation in short text. So not so much about Julian himself, but how that early use of in that strange and how does that fit with you on?
I think the circulation of the short text suggests that she was known as a woman visionary who wrote her book quite early on, and it seems I think it doesn't seem that anyone had a problem with that. There is no, it's. I mean, at this point you're just you are guessing from tiny bits of evidence, but there is no evidence that there was any problem with that. So I think she found actually yes, you can be a woman, you can write about the things of God. It circulates. It doesn't circulate widely, but it maybe circulates against amongst mystical specialists. But I think the fact that she then kind of ungenders herself in the later redaction and version suggests, I think, more that having realised that she could write as a woman, she seems to be realising that she doesn't have to.
So I've got a question from Beth online, and she asks, this was during the talk rather than at the end, are we only making assumptions of Julian's hormonal stage of development, i.e. was she postmenopausal? Do we know? Why would we want to know? Because it would really have made a huge difference in her creature comforts.
We don't know. I mean, this is amongst. Maybe we need to hear the question again.
Oh, okay, sorry. Are we only making assumptions of Julian's hormonal stage of development, i.e. was she postmenopausal? Do we know? Why would we want to know? Because it would really have made a huge difference in her creature comforts.
We don't know. I mean, she said, she reports being 30 when she's writing, when she has the vision. If she's writing, if in the kind of Nicholas Watson dating, she doesn't actually write the short text until quite a bit later, that could be around the time when she's becoming menopausal. Yeah. I mean, it could be that that's a moment in which all kinds of things in her life change simultaneously. But, again, we don't know.
Yes,
sorry.
lady.
Because they really are 1394, no mention of the boys, not I think it seems to me that what playing beyond something is not maybe she wasn't and then very hard for the next thing to do. I think circulation ideas
Yeah.
Is there evidence that she had children?
There is no evidence. Some people think so, but there's no evidence one way or the other. The scene in which the deathbed scene she describes doesn't sound like she was enclosed or a nun at that point. It sounds more like she was in secular life because there's her mother and a parish priest there. But and people then and then it's more, by the time a woman who is assumed to be reasonably well off is 30, it would be kind of surprising for her not to have either married or become a nun. But but who knows? So some people hypothesize that okay, so there's her mother, there's no husband, so she'd been married and widowed, and it's possible. Of course, it's possible. It's also possible that she was a very unusual woman who decided that she could afford to live unmarried and think about God. Also possible. We don't know. Sorry, very long way around to say we don't know. Many of the questions about Julian are we don't know.
There's somebody at the back, but there's a request online. Could you repeat the question once you've heard it?
Yes.
So that the people who are joining us online can understand. Thank you. Lady at the back.
Stand up for that reason. Is there any evidence or any sense that the development the option between the short text and the mind and are there any authenticity if someone else other than Julian may have been involved in change.
Good question. So for the benefit of people online, the question there is, could some of the changes between the short and the long texts be explained by the involvement of somebody else participating in the creation of the text? And they could be, of course. You can't rule anything out. My instinctive feeling is no. My instinctive feeling is that the long text feels like a development of the short text, and it feels like the same person who is developing their thought. That's what it feels like to me. But of course it is possible that somebody else may have been involved with the writing, that she may in fact been kind of responding to some feedback from the first version, and maybe some of the feedback was what encouraged her to make some of these changes.
I have a question. Can I ask you? I'm interested how you balanced it. So you talked about Liz McAvoy and her beautiful poetic understanding of the womb and the hazelnut and the enclosure. And certainly in my readings of Julian, I've always thought about the kind of poetic language, which often has felt to me to be very feminine. So I just wondered how you reconciled that with the more masculine or this idea of the creature and the non-gendered. How do you hold both of those ideas?
I don't feel that she has to be consistent about this. I don't think she has to be straight single-minded about it. I think she can be multiple. She can be writing in multiply gendered ways as well as ungendered ways. And I really do. I love these readings of the hazelnut and the womb and the enclosure. I think I think they are picking out something which is undoubtedly there in the text and bringing it to clarity. I just think there are other things in the text which aren't doing that.
Just to comment on that, I've just been reading John of the Cross, and that thing that you said about the contemplative, girls would be boys and boys would be girls. You only have to read John of the Cross to see. There's a completely different way of looking at love in Christ, which you can't put into a box.
Any other questions at the back there?
I was just really struck, thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful. I was really struck by the images that you showed of the tree book. And that's something I was noticing as well, then, is how that kind of public presentation changes over the years. It's slightly unfair question, it's a half a year and then look to the future. But we've had that which we demonstrated that evolution from Julian as a mystic to the emphasis on Julian as a ruler and leader and rights. Do you have a sense of things, are things changing? There was a new mission. Or is that such a sense of Julian as a raising writer settled squarely on his two legs of balance? Is it Julian as a female writer or is such a
I think
Could you repeat the question?
Oh yes, sorry. It's a question about the book covers and the packaging of Julian, and is that packaging of Julian now as a woman writer settled, or might it be changing? And I mean, my sense, obviously I'm not a publisher, is that Julian as woman writer is just too good a hook for anyone to give up. That in this moment of the reduction in humanities teaching, for example, certainly hits medievalists hard. And so one of the ways in which, as a medievalist, you make the case for your relevance is to say, look, but we can attach to other bits of the curriculum here. Look, we can do life writing, we can do women's writing. We're not just this zone of the weird. There are things about us that are recognisable. So yeah, Julian, the woman writer, I think is just not something we're going to want to give up.
So maybe Sarah is pioneering Julian, the non-binary writer. There's a question online, so we'll take that and then one of them.
Yeah, so this is from Jill Butterworth. She says, in juxtaposing the littleness of the hazelnut and Mary's littleness, Julian says of Mary that no created thing is above her except the blessed humanity of Christ. So she's also exalting Mary as high as she can, exclamation mark.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
Can you repeat that?
Do I need to repeat that, or can they see it?
I think I'm close enough to
Okay.
have heard it.
Yeah.
And they can read it.
And they can read it. Yeah, I completely agree that that marrying devotion is a really important thing in Julian's text.
Andrea at the back.
Julian is still in Norwich, we still have many Julians. And therefore, and then it's interesting how you begin qualifying as a mother or Julian actress. But the Julian part, it's something that was a way of talking about this whole community. This was a woman.
So for the benefit of people online, was Julian a woman's name or a man's name? Why is she, then qualified as Mother Juliana or some such? Yeah, absolutely. The feminizing touches are deliberate in order to clarify that she was a woman, but actually Middle English Julian is a perfectly ordinary woman's name. Modern Gillian. The Saint Julian of the Church is a man. It's what so people have sometimes thought maybe she took the name of the church as at her enclosure, and maybe she did. It certainly wasn't usual practice, but then she wasn't usual in many ways, and it would be kind of in keeping with her drive to anonymity and dissolving herself into a text that she should take on the name of the church. Well, but alternatively, it was just coincidence, and her name was Julian all along, is equally possible.
Another one.
Thanks, Sarah. As you know, Matthew was very much influenced by some British Sweden work, and in fact, the role of her as a mother of many children as well. But we never hear Bridget mention the connection with Julian, considering follow up to the second. I wonder how much you think she might have had some influence on Julian's understanding and early interpretation.
I mean, from, okay, so for repeating the question, so whether Julian might have read Bridget of Sweden, whether she might have been influenced by Bridget of Sweden, whose writings were certainly circulating in English translation and were known to Marjorie Kemp. Yes, she could, yeah, absolutely, she could have known it. I just can't, I can't see it quite. I can't see any moment in Julian's writing where I think that's definitely Bridget. That you know, that there are, of course, you know, there's a lot in common. For example, you know, an interest in the Virgin, you know, say. But I've never really spotted such an example. I mean, other people may well know better who've looked into this in more detail. You know, I confess I haven't.
Conversations. Yes.
Okay, so that's a question about the term man and whether it can be truly, you know, whether it is a true generic in Middle English, and it can be because there are the gendered terms for man that we have that have dropped out of modern English. So, for example, that the you know, the I think it's Harley Maidhead, it's one of the anchoritic texts anyway, writes about wep men and wim men. You know, weapon men and womb men, when it wants to do, when it wants to do gender distinctions. Whereas, you know, simply man just means people and humanity. But it, you know, but the ambiguity is there actually, because also, you know, certainly by the time Julian is writing, man can also mean man as in male adult person in the modern sense, but that it's got a, you know, it's got a better chance also of being a true generic.
Salih.
Hi, mine. When you think of even Christians, do you think that's quickly the way of saying I'm speaking to you with, because if we're even Christians in her, then she would speak out and good. It's not just the message to men. Whereas I think people see that most people fear that.
Okay, so a question about Julian's use of the term even Christian as the people she's addressing and who, you know, who is encompassed in that. Certainly, I think, you know, as a woman reading it, you would, you ought to feel included by it. It is certainly, it's meant to be everybody. It's meant to be even Christians. If you happen to know as well that Julian was a woman writer, I think that would help you as a woman to feel included. But it does, you know, again, it means everybody.
Well, thank you. Any yes,
Sorry, my brain's gone. Given that when Jesus is questioned, he says, you know, people in heaven are neither given nor taken in marriage. And we have the angelic state, which is not gendered. Do you think that Julian is a very important pointer to a blessed state of non-discriminatory or fluid gender in the Christian soul?
Okay, so quite a question there about whether Julian might point to the angelic state of being ungendered. Yes, I think so. I think the idea that of the idealization of being ungendered, the ideal of undoing sexualization and genderization, you know, it is there. It's there in late medieval devotional culture. I do personally think that that Julian herself may have felt herself to be aspiring to that condition, but it's, you know, it is very much open to argument.
Well, thank you very much,
you.
Sarah, for a wonderful lecture. I love the idea that we invited Sarah and have always thought of Sarah as writing a feminist, and through teaching a course in women's medieval literature has led you to think about Julian in new and non-gendered ways. I find that incredibly exciting, and I hope all of you did as well. So let's join our hands and say thank you.